and welcome to this another episode of ECCB Connects. Social security officials from across the Caribbean came together in St. Kitts and Nevis from 6 to 9 June for the 29th meeting of CARICOM Heads of Social Security. In delivering the featured address at the opening ceremony, Governor Antoine focused on the imperatives for sustainability. He called on the region's governments to adopt fiscal resilience frameworks to help safeguard the sustainability of social security systems. In this episode of ECCB Connects, we bring you an excerpt from Governor Antoine's address.
Our meeting convenes at a time when global growth is projected around 3.9% this year and next year. However, risks abound, including trade wars, rising global prices, of course, except for Trinidad and Tobago and Suriname, and climate change. Growth in CARICOM is still too low and too slow, with growth projected between 1% and 2% for this year and next year. Within the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union, we're actually projecting about 2.7% this year and about 3.5% next year. Low growth, aging populations, and high unemployment are weighing on most of our social security schemes. Against this backdrop, it comes as no surprise that the sustainability of these schemes is a question that preoccupies the minds of heads of social security. So in this address, I propose to do three things. First, to highlight the criticality of social security systems and the link with government's fiscal situation. Second, to identify global trends and regional challenges that impinge on sustainability. And third, to offer a few recommendations. So I want to begin with three messages. The first is this: the adoption of fiscal resilience frameworks by governments is critical to help safeguard the sustainability of social security schemes. Fiscal resilience frameworks. Second, governments and social security schemes ought to adopt a sense of urgency about implementation of key reforms by publishing time-bound action plans and annual progress reports. And the third collective message is this: collective action as a region is essential to manage risks and seize opportunities, because they're both, that confront social security schemes. Collective action is critical to manage risk and opportunities that confront our social security schemes. Most of you know that all of us appreciate the power and the impact of social security on our economies and on our communities. In CARICOM, social security as a percentage of reserves of GDP is around 24%. So almost quarter. If you think about the size of our CARICOM GDP, the reserves of our CARICOM social security systems are about 24%. Within the ECCU, it's around 34%. So almost a third. You are managing 1/3 of our national income as a regional economy. The reserves under your management constitute 1/3 of our regional economy, for those of you who are in the ECCU. For those of you who come from the CARICOM wide area, you are managing about a fourth, a quarter. So you are extremely important, and it has been said and it must be reiterated, much depends on you. Take a look at deposits to GDP in the ECCU, 9.5%. Now that's an average. But I can tell you there are banks in the ECCU or countries in the ECCU where that number is closer to 30%. And if you look at the regional government securities market, which is a market that the ECCU governments use to raise money, treasury bills and bonds, 9.3% of GDP. And I can tell you in the ECCU, the governments have raised over $12 billion over the last 15, 16 years from this market, and social security schemes have played a very important part. When we look at administrative costs, those costs are now averaging around 18%, with some countries over 20%. There's one country I looked at that's as high as 26%. So we have an issue. with costs. As we think about health insurance, for example, and many of our countries are discussing health insurance now, it might be an opportune time to spread some of those costs across your existing administration, understanding, of course, that there has to be a separate contribution for health insurance. In other words, it has to be funded. But that with your existing apparatus, both staff and investment frameworks, you might be in a position to deliver service and in so doing, improve the cost efficacy of the schemes. And that's something you want to keep in mind because many of our governments are talking now about health insurance. I must tell you, when I was preparing to share some thoughts on this, I found the lack of data a little troubling. Now, all of you will tell me, Governor, we present our actual reports and we present our annual financial reports to our government and to Parliament. And I'm not taking dispute with that. The question is, how timely is that? And I found going to some of the websites, it is not as timely as it ought to be. And I don't know why in 2018 that should be an issue. Social security schemes, we are called to a very high standard of corporate governance. And we need to have these reports published early and on time for all to see. In the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, we are mandated by law to produce our annual report, including audited financial statement, 3 months after the end of our financial year. In fact, because we have to do that by law and because we understand the importance of what we do and the public interest in this matter, we produce weekly financial statements. Now, I'm not asking you to do that because that requires a certain level of effort within the organization. But surely, we cannot be seeing these reports 2 and 3 years after the fact. Because I think in so doing, we are missing an opportunity for an early and effective engagement with our leaders, political leaders, as well as our contributors, the general public, on these issues of reform. So let's give ourselves a better chance by publishing early. Now, the connection with the fiscal situation. All of you would appreciate that the governments are the largest contributors to our social security schemes, yes? And also, in many cases, the largest borrower. Now, there are some countries where government is so exposed, or they are so exposed to government that as much as 70% of the portfolio are invested in government securities. Social security is probably the most important social programs our governments have ever designed. Just think about it. Because I treat education separately. I see education as an investment. So I'm not speaking of education. But social protection and what you hold in your hand, of which you are the custodians, is perhaps the single most important social programs designed by our governments. We cannot fail. But having said that, I'm less concerned about failing than about having to take action to save the thing at the 99th hour when we are, in so doing, could visit hardship on people. And that is why I argue for timely adjustments to the schemes. If in most, if not all of the legal frameworks of our social security schemes, government has an explicit role to step in and ensure that the schemes are able to deliver benefits. Yes? Correct. So that's what is in government essentially contingent liabilities. I don't know how many governments realize that, but that's the reality. That has direct implications for fiscal and debt sustainability. In the event that governments are required to intervene, their response will be predicated by fiscal space. And it is no secret that many of our governments in this region have little or no fiscal space. So, faced with an intervention, what is going to happen? The governments will have to increase debt. We already know that we are already highly indebted as a region. Increase taxes. Nobody particularly likes that. Debt restructuring. Some of us have been through that difficult experience. And or reduce benefits. And in a worst case scenario, all four. Consequently, in my humble estimation, our governments must put their fiscal houses in order. I want to repeat that. Our governments ought to put their fiscal houses in order. My call for fiscal resilience, sometimes referred to as fiscal responsibility, is really an appeal to give as I said last week at the CDB annual meetings, to give small island developing states like ourselves a fighting chance to survive in a very hostile global economy, pregnant with risks, of which climate change is a particularly obvious one. And so I've said, and I repeat, after the global financial crisis, the situation was made far worse in many of our countries, including my own where I was at the time, because there was no fiscal space. And when governments ought to have been spending more to cushion the effect on the population, our government was spending less. They were cutting capital expenditure, and in so doing, hurting growth and hurting the economy. But they didn't do that because they were wicked and insensitive. They did it because there was no fiscal space. And so what we did subsequently, and I go back to my time in Grenada for a minute, to enact fiscal responsibility legislation was directly coming out of that understanding and recognizing that we had to build some buffers. Because you see, we can look at the economy and have all our great and grand plans. But when we get a Irma or Maria, as Dominica knows only too well, and Anguilla, that changes everything. And that's the point I make. So sometimes when I hear people having the discussion about their grand plans, I am making the point, some things are outside of our control. We hope for a relatively mild season, one that does not hurt us too much like last year, but who knows? The question is, that is not within our control. And what we have to focus on as policymakers and as practitioners is what is within our control.
You're watching ECCB Connects, protecting our currency, developing our region. And now for this week's financial tip.
Hi, my name is Leola Harrigan from First Citizens Investment Services St. Lucia. Start your retirement fund as soon as you start working. It's your way of ensuring that your golden years will be truly golden.
To view any episode of ECCB Connects anytime, any place, at your convenience, check us out on YouTube or Facebook at ECCB Connects.
Here's where we end this week's episode of ECCB Connects. Remember, ECCB Connects is produced by the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank to share with you who we are, what we do, and how we serve you. Thanks for watching, and do join us again next week when we'll be back with another program.